Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.
America in the 1920s. The World War is over, and we are eager to get on with our lives. Prosperity is returning, and we are ready for fun. We want to be entertained. And it's in the year 1920 when a handful of pioneers rush to get the official government permission to entertain the public with a new device they are calling radio. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's KDKA will be the first licensed radio station, and the 1920s will become radio's most important decade. But in the quiet, simple past of 10 years earlier, radio broadcasting had already come and gone in the small farm town of San Jose, California. There, every week between 1912 and 1917, inventor Charles Herrold and his wife Sybil used this crude transmitting device to broadcast programs of music and news to an audience of hundreds. But before 1920, even the word broadcast was only used by farmers. It meant to scatter seeds out in all directions from a single source, to broadcast them. Charles Herrold invented this wireless telephone to broadcast entertainment programs from his station, and he did it back in 1912, before practically anyone even thought about it. But if Herrold was such an important broadcast pioneer, why doesn't anyone know about him? And why was his story lost for most of the 20th century? Why did Charles Herrold literally vanish from history?
Herrold said, well, why don't we broadcast to the community, to San Jose, to the Bay Area, to California, and entertain them with music and give them news and comedy and do all kinds of things and make it a public entertainment, a public information source.
Herrold's intent was to broadcast on a regular basis to a known audience, and in that he was first. There's no question about that, he was first.
What I find particularly interesting about Herrold and why he stands out in my mind is that he starts early, prior to 1910, and that he continues all the way up to World War I when, for reasons beyond his control, he and others are taken off the air. The reason we know less about him today is he doesn't continue into the 1920s and the 1930s, again for reasons which today aren't particularly crucial.
Charles Herrold is born in 1875 in this house in northern Illinois. His father, Civil War Captain William Morris Herrold, operates the town flour mill and grain elevator. His mother, Mary Elizabeth, is a school teacher and Bible lecturer. Soon, Charles will have a younger brother. 10 years later, the Herrold family decides to go west. They end up in the agricultural town of San Jose, California. William Herrold buys land and becomes a successful prune farmer. He also invents and receives patents for several mechanical farming implements. Perhaps it is his influence that will inspire young Charles to show an early interest in science and mechanics. Herrold attends this high school between 1891 and 1894, and he impresses his teachers with a knowledge of many subjects. He writes music and plays the piano. He teaches chemistry to fellow high school students. He builds microscopes and masters photography. He learns about electricity and studies the early work of the great inventors. Charles Herrold grew up in this house, built in 1888 by his father. Looks about the same as it did 100 years ago. Imagine Charles as a young boy working on a project up in the attic or working on some kind of electrical experiments down in the basement. Behind the house there is a barn, and up on its roof Herrold and his father construct an observatory. It's here on long summer nights that 15-year-old Charles develops his passion for astronomy. A couple of times each week, he visits nearby Lick Observatory and pesters the staff until they teach him the position of many of the visible stars and planets. He invents this clock-driven telescope, which uses grains of sand to change weights and balances so that the telescope can follow objects across the sky. Next, 20-year-old Charles enters nearby Stanford University, intending to make astronomy his lifelong career. But when the only professor in the astronomy department leaves unexpectedly, Charles has to declare a new major. He switches to physics and turns in a new direction, electricity and wireless. It will be his future. Herrold is a college student at a unique time in the history of science and technology. The start of a new century with new inventions almost daily, and the coming revolution in communications.
– 150 years ago, we started with communication by electricity, with the telegraph, writing at a distance, the telephone, which was sound at a distance. And with the spread of communications by electrical means and the research work that had been done by people like James Clerk Maxwell and Faraday and others, the idea began to percolate that perhaps it would be possible to communicate at a distance electrically, but without wires. Marconi in particular saw enormous commercial applicability for that, particularly for ships at sea, where you could not string wires. It became very, very significant in 1901 when Marconi succeeded in signaling across the Atlantic with the famous S, which was dit, dit, dit.
With all the publicity surrounding Marconi's wireless, Charles Herrold can't wait to be an inventor himself. He drops out of Stanford and moves north to San Francisco, where he starts a company and begins to invent and manufacture mechanical and electrical devices for dentistry and surgery, even deep-sea diving. He eventually becomes chief engineer for a San Francisco wireless company, a position he holds until the Great Earthquake of 1906. He loses everything: his personal possessions, his grand piano, his inventions. He flees San Francisco, taking these photos of the ruined city. Settling temporarily in Stockton, California, he secures a teaching position at the local College of Mining and Engineering. He discovers he likes students, and they like him. As a young man of 30, Charles Herrold finds a vocation he will pursue for the next quarter century. Charles Herrold loved the water. He liked to sit aboard his boat in this California delta and read. Now here's a book that really excited Charles. It's Looking Backward. It was published in 1897, written by Edward Bellamy. Looking Backward is a story of a utopian society in the far future, the year 2000. In chapter 11, Bellamy describes how every home is equipped to receive programs of music using the wires of the newly invented telephone. Charles Herrold began to get an idea about how he, too, could send programs of music and other entertainment into people's homes, but using the wireless, a new invention that some people even believe could be made to talk. This was 1907. This was a revolutionary idea by Herrold, and it came 10 years before RCA Chairman David Sarnoff had his idea for a radio music box in every home.
Sarnoff worked for RCA, and RCA had a wonderful public relations operation. And they started a library, which is still there, in Princeton. And that library saved every piece of paper David Sarnoff ever breathed upon. And among other things was this so-called, and I say so-called, memo of 1916, the famous radio music box memo. So-called because some recent researchers have argued, in fact, it was probably written, but probably, in fact, written several years later, and only later on into the 20s or 30s, perhaps predated back to make it look like Sarnoff was unusually prescient.
Will there someday be a wireless that speaks words instead of dots and dashes? At first, most inventors agree with Marconi, who believes that the wireless should be used for two-way business communication. The use of Morse code was an advantage. Most people couldn't understand it, therefore it was private. There are a persistent few who refuse to see wireless remain in its telegraph form. One of the first and most important is Canadian inventor Reginald Fessenden, who in 1900 transmits voice using a spark. A Fessenden researcher has recreated that very first voice transmission. This is what it probably sounded like. Several years later, on Christmas Eve, 1906, Fessenden uses this alternator to send a program of music and voice to nearby ships. His historic transmission comes from this station. Many believe it was the first radio broadcast. Then there is Lee DeForest. Like Fessenden and Herrold, DeForest also believes that the wireless will someday talk.
DeForest was very interested in sending music and sending, he started with opera and as early as about 1908, sending things that could be appreciated from a cultural standpoint. I think he did foresee broadcasting in a way that many people attribute to David Sarnoff 8 or 10 years later.
By 1908, Herrold wants to return to his family. He has plans to start his own school and to experiment with the transmission of voice and music using the wireless. In January 1909, Charles Herrold returns to San Jose and opens a wireless college. Known to his students as Doc or Prof. Herrold, he will be a major influence on several generations of young radio enthusiasts. Boys start out by hearing and reading about the exciting tales of young wireless operators, and they end up at the Herrold College as students.
2 months from today, I'll be walking across the campus at Stanford, girl on my arm, letter on my sweater. It's gonna be heaven.
Joe College.
That's me. How about you?
Working on my dad's farm, I guess. Said I wouldn't, but I guess I'll have to.
You wouldn't have to if you'd stayed on the football squad. You'd be going to college with me. You'd have a scholarship. Instead, you had to waste all your time after school working on that stupid wireless stuff.
It's not stupid. Wireless is the future. It's gonna connect us all together, everybody, everywhere, from coast to coast.
Anybody ever tell you have a one-track mind?
You should talk. Football and girls.
Girls and football, please.
Someday I bet they'll send football out on the wireless. Wireless that talks.
Yeah, well, that's the day I'll turn in my Letterman sweater and help you build a wireless set.
Games played in San Jose, and people will be able to hear it all across the bay. The entire county. The signal will go out like ripples in a pond.
Hey, you're scaring away the fish.
It was something that caught the imagination of young boys. By 1911, after there was some publicity about interception of some wireless messages, there was a club in Los Angeles with 200 high school boys in it. And so in this period, it became what in many ways computers have been for kids in the last 10 or 15 years.
Herrold was an excellent teacher, and he wouldn't have attracted all those young men to take an interest in this thing called radio if he didn't have a special kind of curiosity and a way of demonstrating to these young people that it's an exciting thing to find out what's on the new frontier of knowledge.
The College of Wireless and Engineering is a major success. And so between 1909 and 1917, Charles Herrold spends most of his time training young people to send and receive Morse code so that they can get jobs as wireless operators. In 1913, Herrold's students draw this wedding announcement on a classroom blackboard. As their professor nears 40, he marries 18-year-old Sybil Paul. He brings her into the college as an instructor. Their son Robert is born in 1915.
Well, my first memories are of when my mother was teaching the code to students. Well, I had a very normal girl growing up. My mother saw to that. She was a good cook, good mother, and she was a strict mother, but she was very good.
I did spend a considerable amount of time talking to my grandmother about Charles Herrold. She always referred to him as Charlie. Most everybody else that knew him referred to him as Doc, but she always referred to him as Charlie. She was quite fascinated with her early life with him, in that she had a lot of contact with the radio station.
Although Charles is now a family man, he continues to spend most of his time during the week at the school teaching or at his lab inventing.
On the weekend, he used to love to be outdoors. But you see, all week he was usually indoors doing his radio business. And then on the weekend, we would go up there and have a kind of an outing. And I would hike around and investigate things. And he had a lot of the students used to go up there, different students used to go up there with him on the weekend. And he would give them an outing that way and a rest from there. They had quite a rigorous routine during the week, studying and whatever they were doing.
Herrold's boys were living the dream of a future in wireless.
We call this blackmail, you know. I think there's a law against it.
What do you mean blackmail? We're going to Barb's party.
Yeah, but you didn't tell me there'd be this little detour along the way. What are we doing here anyway?
Here, hold this aerial.
Sure, but
The higher I can get this aerial wire, the more stations I can get on my wireless set.
you're gonna climb up there?
Well, you're the athlete.
Forget it, look at that thing.
Looks kind of dangerous, huh? Well, can't blame the guy for trying, though.
Not unless he makes me miss this party. Come on, let's go.
Hey, didn't your dad say we could use his cabin whenever we wanted?
You mean his place up in the mountains? Like way up high where your mysterious ether waves can be heard?
Yeah. How'd you know?
How dumb do I look? Don't answer that.
Early Monday morning, it's back to school. But while his students prepare for their careers in wireless telegraphy, Charles Herrold now spends most of his time inventing ways to make his wireless talk.
Well, we already had the model of the telephone after the telegraph. People had become used to using voice communication. Voice communication was capable of personal nuance. Point-to-point circuits was very important. You knew what somebody was thinking when you were talking to them in a way that simply was not true with respect to a telegraphed message. You had the words, but you didn't have the tone, the tenor, and even the context. So it was natural to seek to add to the power of electrical communication at a distance the power of the human voice.
Herrold begins his voice and music transmission experiments in 1908 using the spark gap found in most wireless stations. He soon realizes that a spark will never be good enough to carry voice and music, and if his dream of sending entertainment into homes is to be realized, he will have to invent something better. Some experimenters believe that a direct current, high-frequency arc is a better way to transmit voice and music. Herrold begins to develop his own unique system, which he calls the arc phone. He is assisted by a young wireless enthusiast named Ray Newby.
Doc Herrold, one of the finest gentlemen I ever met.
Newby will work with Herrold between 1908 and 1923. In a 1979 interview, Newby explains how Herrold discovered the arc.
If you want to know how it started, it all started from the old street lamp. I think most everybody has heard the rattle of an old arc light starting. There were millions of them in San Jose at that time. They had them up on the tower. Herrold took that arc and he says, if I can increase the frequency of that singing tone that's in this arc light, the street arc lamp, I have a chance of having a carrier wave that will support voice or music maybe. And that's exactly what he did. He says, to handle more power, we'll put the arcs in series. And he took 6 arc lights and put them in series, one after another, like you hook up dry batteries. That same principle of the street arc light was used in here, but instead of having only one, he used 6. And they were burning under distilled water. He even used alcohol in there. I was afraid he'd blow the roof. Burning arc lights underneath alcohol. He says, that's safe as long as the alcohol doesn't evaporate. Power was taken from the streetcar line. The power, 500 volts DC, by tapping the line. We stole the juice there for a while.
I wish there was a wire left to heaven, and I could speak to Mama every day.
By 1912, Herrold has invented and received a number of patents for the pieces that will form the basis of his radio telephone system. The arc phone is a simple mechanical radio transmitter. It features a magnetic lifting system for the multiple arcs which are burning under liquid. The arcs are in series with a water-cooled telephone-like carbon microphone, which is connected between the arcs and the ground. Large antenna coils couple the arc phone to an outside aerial. Using the call letters FN and SJN, Herrold puts the arc phone on the air several hours every day, transmitting phonograph records and conversation from the Herrold College to a receiving station at a San Francisco hotel, a distance of 50 miles. While these are intended as two-way radio-telephone communication experiments, they are heard by hundreds of operators on the West Coast. Another station is set up at a local naval base to demonstrate the Herrold voice transmission system for the government. Both of these early efforts break distance records for voice transmission.
We had no call letters at first. We just had to say, this is the Herrold station. We used to pick our call letters out of the sky. But then the government came in and had to have everyone listed, and you had to have a certain frequency and stay there.
A major disaster gets the government involved in the regulation of wireless. When the Titanic sinks and 1,500 lives are lost, the Radio Act of 1912 is passed. It requires radio operators on most large ships to monitor the airwaves 24 hours a day while at sea. Herrold will hold several licenses. This experimental radio telephone license was issued to Herrold prior to 1916. By 1912, Herrold believes that his ARC phone is good enough for broadcasting to an audience. The ARC phone activity that Herrold says proves his claim to being the father of radio broadcasting is the Wednesday night Little Hams program. Herrold tells his students that the Wednesday night programs are broadcasting for the people of San Jose. He also tells them that everyone else transmitting voice at the time is only narrowcasting. He is on every week at the same time, and he knows that he is entertaining a public audience. And as an early form of advertising, the broadcasts help attract students to his college. This is the improved ARC phone that Charles Herrold used for his Wednesday night broadcasts. It survives because he gave it to museum owner Doug Parham back in the 1940s. Imagine that it's 1912 and you're a disc jockey, and this is both your studio and your transmitter. When you wanted to make an announcement, you spoke into this microphone, but you had to be careful. You couldn't get too close or touch it because the microphone was in series with the high voltage used to generate the arc. And because the high voltage made the microphone heat up, it was water cooled. Circulating water actually ran through this microphone at all times. Now, if you wanted to play a record, you cranked up the phonograph. You can see how this modified bell is aimed in the general direction of the microphone. Pick up the sound. The major audience for these broadcasts were the young kids who built their own wireless sets, the young experimenters. They had to build their own radios. They loved it.
I can't believe you're still fooling with this junk. We've been up here 3 days, you haven't even been out on the pond yet.
I've almost got it this time.
You know where you can find me when you come to your senses.
Wait a minute. Put these on.
I only got 2 hands, I gotta untangle my line.
So put the receivers on your head.
You don't know what you're missing. There's a couple cute girls on the other side of the lake. I told them about you. Well, I didn't tell them everything about you. I didn't tell them you were crazy. But I did tell them... Jeez!
You heard something, didn't you?
What the hell is that?
That's Doc Herrold's music. I did it.
Are you trying to tell me that music is coming from that wireless college in town?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Listen.
That's the John Philip Sousa March.
What were you saying about me being crazy?
Shh. I want to hear this.
Plans were made ahead of time for the content of each show. Records were picked out, newspaper stories to read were decided on. Even contests were planned, with the winner getting a small prize like this little piece of galena used to make a crystal receiving set. It was called the Little Hams program because most of the listeners were young experimenters. But Herrold also set up radios in public places, and he and his students built receiving sets for friends and family. These Wednesday night broadcasts continued every week between 1912 and 1917. News of the broadcast began to spread. The audience grew larger. We get some idea of what the public thought about broadcasting from a 1915 editorial in the San Jose newspaper.
Instead of recognizing this as a momentous achievement, as a revolution in communications, the San Jose newspaper editor deplored the fact that this could threaten a lifelike entertainment, that it was sort of an ersatz substitute for the real symphony orchestra.
Every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock he would be on because he knew he had 50 or more listeners, with crystal detectors to report to them. They'd call up on the phone, ask for records and what have you. The listeners were all amateurs that had crystal detectors listening to ships or code or whatever they could learn and read and find, and they were startled to find music coming in on their ears from this Herrold station. Oh, they'd call us right up and say, put on such and such a record, or play over and over, certain ones that they liked better. We even had listeners within, I'd say at that time, and even in the earliest ARC days, it was heard as far away as 900 miles, but under very favorable conditions.
One reason that the Wednesday night broadcasts attract so much attention is because of Herrold's young wife, Sybil.
She became a disc jockey, if you will. They didn't use that term in those days, and I guess she liked it for a while. Because I remember I interviewed her years later, and she was very, very pleased because she got a lot of response from the community. People called up or wrote her fan letters or talked to her on the street that they heard the programs.
And I really believe that I was the first woman to ever broadcast a program. We used to get cards from the little hams asking us to play after we started playing the records for their little programs on Wednesday night.
My grandmother always told me that she was the first, at least the first female disc jockey, she thought, in the world at least.
She used to tell us how she used to go down and get the records from the record store, and she would come and play them over the radio.
And I went to Sherman and Clay and arranged to borrow records.
She would take them back and play them over the radio. And Sherman Clay loved it because the next day they'd sell out of whatever it was she'd played over the radio.
After they got the voice and that perfected and the music broadcasting perfected, why then he was anxious to get it into the homes and so that everyone could enjoy it.
Whether they realize it or not, by presenting programming on a regular basis, Charles and Sybil are developing the first radio audience.
He was purposely trying to do what the popular press of the day was doing, in a smaller sense. He was trying to appeal to a broad-scale audience cutting across the board in an entertainment fashion. Very few people had tried to do that early. And again, very few people had tried to do it on a continuous, scheduled, pre-announced basis.
He did get notice eventually in the local papers from time to time, and back in I think it was 1912 or 13, I found articles where Herrold was inviting people to not only tune him in and hear his programs of music, but he actually invited them to stop off at one of the record stores in town where he had installed listening devices, little receivers. He was endeavoring in every way possible to call attention to what he was doing.
It makes enormous sense for somebody who's interested in sending voice over the air to send a little music, to have something that people can tune into on a regular basis, because you want them to know that you're going to be there, say, on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. You don't want to do it when everybody's at work. You don't want to do it when the boys are at school. And so it begins to make a lot of sense to schedule what we now call a broadcast. And that's essentially what Herrold did. He was the first that I know of to actually schedule a broadcast.
The other event that Herrold believes establishes his claim as the first broadcaster takes place in San Francisco at the Panama Pacific International Exhibition of 1915. Here, at this major event, with the whole world watching, inventor Lee DeForest is just about to reveal a radical new technology for transmitting voice and music, one based on his invention of the three-element vacuum tube known as the Audion. But DeForest cannot get his transmitter to work, and so at the last minute, Herrold is asked to step in and take over, to broadcast daily entertainment from his San Jose station to fairgoers visiting the receiving stations at the Palace of Fine Arts. Herrold puts his ARC phone on every day for 8 hours, and thousands of fairgoers are able to experience broadcasting for the first time.
My grandmother did tell me about that. What I remember her saying was that people wouldn't believe it. It was so early. people wouldn't believe that it was wireless because they never heard voice coming over the air before. Not that they hadn't heard phonograph records, but that was a different story. That was right here on the table. And she said people would look in the back of the booth and look under the table because they thought sure that it was coming from there somewhere, or that there were wires coming that they just couldn't see. And they had to convince them that it was coming from 50 miles away in San Jose.
In 1959, when I had the privilege to interview Lee DeForest himself when he was in his 80s, and asked him point blank, do you believe that Herrold Station deserves credit for being the world's first broadcasting station? He said, I certainly do.
The broadcasts continue until 1917, and between broadcasts, Herrold's audience built wireless receivers.
Can't believe you only had one dry cell. While I was at the hardware store, I picked up some extra aerial wire in the new issue of Electrician and Mechanic.
What happened to girls in football?
Hey, I still like girls. You want to know what you're doing wrong there?
In April 1917, the Herrold broadcasts, along with all other amateur radio activity, come to an abrupt end. By government order, most radio will be silent until April 12, 1919.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Back in on the run, on the run, on the run.
The World War and the new draft lottery is going to turn these young boys into men overnight. This first war to end all wars is also going to have a major impact on wireless and radio. In the name of national security, the federal government makes all inventors work together and pool their patents so that better equipment can be built for defense communications. Many of Herrold's students go to war, and while too old for the draft himself, Herrold serves the war effort, working night and day, training hundreds of radio operators. By 1918, the fighting ends and the diplomacy begins. Our soldiers return home to a hero's welcome. Europe is stable again, and America is forever a permanent player in the international community. Peace and prosperity. The decade of the 1920s begins. President Woodrow Wilson is in failing health and will barely finish his term as president, to be replaced by the lightweight Warren Harding. People continue to leave their farms for the big cities. Normal life is returning to Main Street, and the future looks good. The 1920s bring at least the promise of unlimited riches. The decade of the 1920s will also turn out to be broadcasting's most important. No longer called the wireless telephone, it's now radio. And everything that radio would become will be in place by 1930. Licensed broadcasting, advertiser-supportive programming, radio personalities, networks, everything. The 1920s will be radio broadcasting's defining decade.
We are bringing you early election returns. North Atlantic states give a substantial lead to Warren Harding over James Cox.
It's 1920 and the Commerce Department begins licensing broadcast stations. The first to get the official permission is Frank Conrad's KDKA in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The date is October 27, 1920. And just like Charles Herrold's small audience had discovered 10 years earlier, there is something new on the wireless.
Mom, Dad, come quick. Dad, quick, listen, there's music on the air.
Well, if that don't beat the... Any idea where it's coming from, son?
From Wilkinsburg, just outside of Pittsburgh. A Westinghouse engineer by the name of Conrad is sending it. Isn't it swell? Boy, will I have something to tell the fellas tomorrow.
Well, when KDKA went on the air with those famous election returns in November of 1920, November 2nd, if memory serves, it was an era that when a station went on the air, it went on the air for perhaps an hour or so a day when there was a program, a very particular program or something to cover, or a baseball game or a church service. And then the station goes off the air, and perhaps it comes back on the air later on that same day.
The 1920s also marks the beginning of the organized manufacture of radio receiving sets for the home consumer. The demands of the World War had forced inventors and patent holders to come together, and quality radios are now available. No longer is it necessary for a boy to eat great quantities of oatmeal just to get the box for a homemade crystal set. After all, KDKA's major purpose for broadcasting is to get people to buy radios, built by its owner, Westinghouse. The humble crystal receiving set is slowly being replaced with better and more powerful radios using vacuum tubes. But the biggest change after the war is the technology of the transmitting device. While Charles Herrold had finally perfected his arc phone, essentially mechanical radio, DeForest, KDKA's Conrad, and others are now successfully using the vacuum tube as an electronic means of transmitting radio waves. And with the government licensing of broadcasting, the frequencies assigned to it are not compatible with the now obsolete arc system perfected by Herrold. So as broadcast radio sweeps the nation, Herrold has to throw away his life's work and build a vacuum tube transmitter before he can obtain his broadcasting license. He finally goes on the air in 1921 as KQW. But now, instead of being the only broadcaster, he is one of hundreds, trying to keep his station on the air, trying to find programming. Licensed radio broadcasting is in its first year, and as Herrold nears 50, it looks like a young person's business to this aging father of radio broadcasting. Herrold refuses to give up. In addition to KQW, he continues to train students and sell radio equipment. He begins to do innovative things to demonstrate the use of radio and broadcasting, including a number of public exhibitions. Also, in the early 1920s, Herrold meets a whole new generation of young radio enthusiasts.
I first met Prof. Herrold in 1922, and I was in the 8th grade. And Doc was very encouraging to young people. He didn't talk down to the kids at all. He encouraged them to go ahead, and any way he could help them out, he did. He was a very warm person.
I got acquainted with him by delivering express to him and picking up express shipments in the building. And I recognized him as a very courteous man.
He was a personable person. He would go out and visit people in their homes and barns and places where they had their crystal sets, and help them hook their crystal sets up properly with the antenna and the ground and the whole bit.
I don't think I met anybody, and I interviewed everybody I could possibly find who knew Herrold when I first started my research in 1959. And I talked to a lot of old men who highly respected Herrold. I didn't meet anybody who didn't like the man.
But being well-liked is not enough. Charles Herrold has no corporate backing and therefore little promise of making money from broadcasting. He stays with it because entertaining an audience still excites him.
When I was a kid and I would wake up in the morning and see my crystal set up there, looking at it from my bed, it just looked beautiful to me. And I'm sure that Herrold was as eager to get up every morning and work on his ideas for transmitting out to the public.
As an inventor, Herrold slows down. One of his final inventions is this involute inductance device, apparently a tuning coil to improve radio reception. He even invents a movable sign for the city streetcars. This complicated device is designed to be connected to the trolley wheels to mechanically change advertising messages as the car rolls down the tracks. It is never used.
I'm a dreamer, aren't we all? Just a dreamer, aren't we all? In my dreams each night it seems my sweetheart comes to call.
Broadcasting continues to grow up. It is now 1925, and radio has not only learned to talk, it's speaking loudly. No longer content to listening with earphones, now everyone wants a radio with a loudspeaker. By 1925, there are almost 600 licensed radio stations entertaining audiences with music and talk, and the advertising of products is providing the economic support for radio broadcasting. At the halfway point in broadcasting's decade, radio is maturing quickly. But while these are the boom years for broadcasting, Charles Herrold's fortunes are in decline. His twin obsessions of broadcasting and inventing will cost him everything. First, he loses his wife.
She wanted a little more than just going up to the laboratory and conducting these experiments or even being on the radio. She wanted to go dancing, to go to the silent movies or to the theater, stage shows, vaudeville.
It was the tremendous stress of his business that kept him away a lot of the time. He had to be away or doing things at night too, see, because of his many students.
Sybil divorced Charles Herrold in 1924 and remarried less than 1 year later. New husband Henry True adopted young Robert and changed his name. Charles Herrold loses his son.
Anybody is affected by that. In fact, you go to school one day with Herrold and you come back in the afternoon, your name is True. I can remember I was 12 years old. I had just gone into junior high school, Roseville Junior High School. And then I went down and had it done. And when you come home, I'm a little emotional about this. And so when you come back in the afternoon, your name is True.
By 1925, Herrold is also broke. He can no longer afford to operate KQW. He turns to a local church for help.
So the deal that Herrold worked out with the First Baptist Church is that he would turn over the license to them if in turn they would hire him, employ him as chief engineer. Well, shortly thereafter, I don't know how long the arrangement lasted, but some kind of a misunderstanding occurred. And because Herrold was not a businessman or a lawyer, he didn't have an airtight contract. So they fired him. And the newspaper of that day had a headline, a banner headline that said, "Father of Broadcasting Fired."
The 1920s end with a promise and a crash. Charles Lindbergh gives us hope by flying non-stop from New York to Paris. The experiment called Prohibition is clearly failing. So is the economy. But by 1930, broadcasting is a big business. Radio stars are established, listening habits are formed. The Radio Act of 1927 assigns newer and clearer channels to broadcasters and requires stations to operate in the public interest. NBC and CBS are the first radio networks. By 1930, radio is a major source of entertainment for all Americans. The 1920s have been radio broadcasting's big decade. But for Charles Herrold, it's a different picture. He'll spend his final years in radio in sales. He writes and lectures about advertising. He buys blocks of time on local stations, finds the programming, and then sells the entire package to advertisers. Herrold also tries one more attempt at marriage. This time he marries a woman named Belle, and it's broadcast live on the air. He writes their wedding ceremony as a radio script. After this highly publicized radio marriage, we never hear about Belle again. Mostly in the early 1930s, Herrold begins devoting his energy to proving to the world that he is the father of radio broadcasting. He writes letters to newspapers, and he tells his story on local radio. No one pays attention. In 1930, a grateful world remembers Marconi and Sarnoff for their contributions to the science and business of radio and broadcasting. Charles Herrold is about to disappear from history.
I would say Herrold in his old age was a unhappy man because everything he had done apparently was not being recognized outside of Northern California.
When Charles Herrold was doing his inventing and doing his initial broadcasting, nobody had the faintest idea that it was going to go where it went. It was almost like the talkies when they hit motion pictures. Everybody said this will never last.
So Herrold was the first, but in a sense, he is less well known today than he deserves to be because he was too soon.
This is Oak Hill Memorial Park in San Jose. It's the final resting place for Charles David Herrold. The father of radio broadcasting would spend the last 12 years of his life working a series of menial jobs. He would never invent again. He never worked in radio again. He lived in Oakland alone. In 1936, at age 61, he received a letter from the Oakland City Schools thanking him for working as an audiovisual assistant. During World War II, he worked as a security guard in the Oakland shipyards. Then in 1945, a final but unsuccessful attempt was made to recognize Herrold as the father of radio broadcasting. In a one-hour dramatization over radio station KQW, actor Jack Webb portrayed the life of Herrold. And for this program, an engineer was sent to Herrold's house to preserve on acetate disc the only surviving recording of Herrold's voice.
I'm particularly proud that the dream we had for radio as an entertainment medium has materialized. I am happy to have been the first man to broadcast radio entertainment on a regular schedule.
Just 3 weeks after leaving this Oakland house for a nearby rest home, he dies at the age of 73 of heart failure on July 1st, 1948. The Charles Herrold story might have ended here forever had it not been for Professor Greb. After extensive research in the late 1950s, he organized a celebration to honor Herrold and arranged to have placed historic markers at the site of the original broadcasts.
What I learned from personally talking to radio pioneers and looking at the printed evidence as available to me in newspapers and other documents, including testimonial letters, I'm convinced that Charles David Herrold was the father of broadcasting.
I would argue that he certainly is a father of broadcasting. He's not the father of broadcasting any more than several other people who use the same title. But he certainly is a father. This is an offspring that has lots of parents.
So when we look at Charles Herrold's place in history, I do believe that Charles Herrold was the first broadcaster. And if he wanted to be known as the father of broadcasting, I think that we should let him be known as the father of broadcasting.
It's exciting when you realize that we can trace this modern radio station with its compact discs and these little digital tapes all the way back to Charles Herrold's broadcasts in 1912. But history has ignored Herrold. Now maybe he would have been better known today if he had lived in one of the great population centers on the East Coast or worked for a big company like an RCA or a General Electric. And he also spent too much time working on the wrong technology. Still, we know this, that Herrold was the first to broadcast on a regularly scheduled basis entertainment programming to an audience. Don't you think Charles Herrold deserves a better place in the history of radio broadcasting?
Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.